The advertisement had been blunt. Wanted, woman of sound health and moral character. Purpose, marriage and motherhood. Compensation, security, shelter, respect. Sentimentality, none. Respond to R. Calder, Calder Ranch, Montana Territory. Elena Ward had read it 17 times before the ink dried on her reply. Not because she was uncertain, uncertainty was a luxury she'd lost years ago, but because she needed to memorize every word, every implication, every escape clause that wasn't written. She'd learned the hard way that what men didn't say mattered more than what they did. The stagecoach lurched over another rut, and Elena braced herself against the wooden seat, her gloved hands pressed flat against faded calico. 4 other passengers shared the cramped space. A salesman who'd talked himself hoarse by noon, a minister's wife whose disapproval radiated like heat from a stove, a young couple who couldn't stop touching each other's hands, and a prospector who smelled like he'd been underground for a month. Elena had claimed this corner by the window and hadn't moved in 8 hours. The Montana landscape rolled past, endless, brutal, beautiful, in a way that made her chest tight. She'd grown up in Philadelphia, where buildings blocked the sky and people stacked on top of each other like cordwood. Then she'd tried Ohio, then Kansas, teaching positions that lasted until some man's wife decided Elena was too young, too unmarried, too much of a threat. Never mind that Elena had never looked twice at a married man. Never mind that she'd spent her evenings alone, correcting arithmetic papers by candlelight, eating day-old bread because it was cheaper. She was 31 years old, and she was tired. Tired of rented rooms that smelled like other people's cooking. Tired of Sunday dinners where she was the only one without family. Tired of the way married women looked at her, half pity, half suspicion, as if being alone was either tragic or catching. She'd stopped believing in romance around the same time she'd stopped believing her father would come back from the war. Some things just didn't happen for some people, and the sooner you accepted that, the less it hurt. So when she'd seen Calder's advertisement in the back of a 2-month-old newspaper someone had left in the boarding house parlor, something had clicked into place. Not hope. She'd learned better than that. But recognition. Here was a man who wasn't pretending. No flowery language about companionship or affection. No lies about building a life together. Just the bare truth. He needed something. She needed something. Maybe they could make an arrangement that didn't require anyone to lie about their feelings. She'd written back that same night. His response had arrived 3 weeks later, short, factual. If she was still interested, she should arrive by the end of September. He'd send money for passage. She should bring whatever belongings she valued, because the ranch was a full day's ride from the nearest town, and trips were infrequent. There was a room prepared. A minister would be available within the week of her arrival. No questions about her background. No request for a photograph. No assurances of any kind except the stark ones already outlined. Elena had packed her trunk, given notice at the school where she'd been teaching, and ignored the headmistress's tisking about desperate measures and dignity. Dignity was another luxury. You couldn't eat it, couldn't shelter under it when winter came. The stagecoach crested a hill, and the driver called out, "Calder Station, 10 minutes!" Elena's stomach clenched, but her hands stayed steady. She'd made harder choices, survived worse gambles. The young couple across from her were whispering, their heads close together. The bride wore a wedding ring so new it still shone. The groom kept touching her shoulder, her hand, her cheek. Small gestures of reassurance that said, "I'm here, we're together, nothing can hurt us." Elena looked away. The station was nothing more than a flat stretch of dirt, where the road widened, a water trough for the horses, and a wooden sign that read "Calder" in letters nearly worn smooth by wind. A single rider waited beside a black horse, his posture so still he could have been carved from the same hard stone as the mountains behind him. The stagecoach shuddered to a halt. The driver climbed down, started unloading bags and crates with the efficient roughness of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. Elena gathered her carpet bag, her traveling cloak, the small valise that held the only book she'd allowed herself to bring, a volume of Whitman, the pages soft from rereading. She stepped down into the Montana dust, and the world felt bigger than it ever had before. Wider. Emptier. The wind carried the smell of sage and distance. The rider swung off his horse in one fluid motion and walked toward her. He was tall, taller than she'd expected, though she hadn't let herself expect anything. broad across the shoulders in the way of men who worked with their hands and their backs. His face was weathered, lined at the corners of the eyes, hard in the way stone was hard, not cruel, just unyielding. Dark hair, darker eyes, a jaw that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. Miss Ward? Not a question. His voice was low, roughened by wind or shouting, or maybe just disuse. Mr. Calder. She met his gaze straight on, the way she'd met every skeptical school board and dismissive landlord. She'd learned young that if you flinched first, you lost. He studied her for a moment, taking inventory, she realized, the same way he'd probably assess a horse at auction, checking for soundness, durability, value. You're older than I expected, he said. Most women would have been offended. Elena just shrugged. Your advertisement didn't specify an age requirement. No? Something that might have been approval flickered in his expression, gone too fast to be sure. It didn't. He gestured toward her trunk, which the driver had dumped unceremoniously beside the stagecoach. That everything? Yes. He loaded her trunk onto the back of a flat wagon she hadn't noticed before, tied down with rope that had clearly seen heavy use, then offered his hand to help her up to the seat. His palm was calloused, warm despite the cool air. Elena settled herself, arranging her skirts, while Rhett climbed up beside her and took the reins. They started moving, the wagon creaking, the horse's hooves raising small clouds of dust. The stagecoach pulled away in the opposite direction, and Elena felt the last thread connecting her to her old life snap clean. How far? She asked. 2 hours. He didn't look at her, just kept his eyes on the road that wasn't really a road, more like a suggestion worn into the grass by repeated passage. We'll be there before dark. Good. They rode in silence. Elena had spent enough time around taciturn men, her father, before the war, the school janitor in Ohio who'd spoken maybe 20 words in 6 months, to know that some people didn't waste breath on empty talk. She didn't mind. After 8 hours trapped in the stagecoach with the chattering salesman, silence felt like a gift. The land opened up around them. Rolling grassland stretched to horizons that seemed impossibly distant, broken only by clusters of cottonwood where creeks cut through the earth. Mountains rose to the west, their peaks already touched with snow that would deepen as autumn turned. The sky was so big it felt like falling upward. It's beautiful, Elena said, surprising herself. Rhett glanced at her, just a quick cut of his eyes. It's hard. Those aren't mutually exclusive. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough to suggest he wasn't entirely made of granite. No, he agreed. They're not. Another mile passed, then another. The house has 4 bedrooms, Rhett said abruptly, as if he'd been working through a mental list of things she needed to know and had reached the first item. Yours is on the east side. Morning light. The cook comes in twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays. She'll leave provisions for the other days. There's a root cellar, a smokehouse, a spring house. Chickens. 2 milk cows. Elena listened, filing away each detail. I've got men who work the cattle, he continued. You won't see much of them. They stay in the bunkhouse, take meals there. I keep the accounts in the study, first door on the right from the main room. You're welcome to review them if you want to understand how the ranch operates. Thank you. He nodded once, sharp and definite, like he'd completed a transaction, which, Elena supposed, he had. There are rules, he said. Of course there were. Men like Rhett Calder didn't operate without structure. I'm listening. My study is private. You don't enter without permission. Same with the barn workshop. That's where I keep tools that can't be replaced easily, and I don't want them moved or borrowed without asking. Reasonable. I expect meals at regular times. 6 in the morning, noon, 6 in the evening. I don't care what you cook as long as it's edible and ready when it should be. I can manage that. The books in the house belong to my mother. You can read them, but they stay where they are. Something in his tone made Elena look at him more closely. His jaw was tight, his hands firm on the reins, but not rough. She's passed? 10 years ago. I'm sorry. He didn't acknowledge the condolence. You'll need winter clothes, heavier than what you're wearing. I'll take you into town next month, and you can order what you need from the mercantile. I have some money saved. It's my responsibility. He said it flatly, like stating a fact. You're here because of an arrangement I proposed. I'll provide what's necessary. Elena had learned to recognize pride when she heard it, not the puffed-up kind that crumbled under pressure, but the bone-deep kind that made a man keep his word even when it cost him. All right. They crested a low rise, and the ranch spread out below them. It wasn't what Elena had imagined, not because it was disappointing, but because she'd tried so hard not to imagine anything at all. The house was larger than she'd expected, built from logs that had weathered to silver gray, with a wide porch that wrapped around two sides. Behind it stood a massive barn, a cluster of smaller outbuildings, corrals where horses moved like dark water against the fences. Beyond that, grassland rolled away toward distant bluffs, dotted with cattle that looked like toys from this distance. It was an empire, small and self-contained, a kingdom carved out of wilderness by someone who refused to bend. It's impressive, Elena said. Rhett's hands tightened on the reins, just for a second. It's work. They descended toward the ranch, the wagon wheels finding ruts that said this path had been traveled countless times. As they drew closer, Elena could see details, the clean lines of the fences, the neat stack of firewood beside the house, the shutters that hung straight and square. Everything was maintained, nothing left to rot or sag. This was a place where chaos wasn't allowed. Rhett pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down. He unloaded Elena's trunk with the same efficiency he'd loaded it, carrying it up the porch steps and through the front door without waiting for her to follow. Inside, the house smelled like wood smoke and linseed oil. The main room was dominated by a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, with furniture that looked handmade, solid, plain, built to last. A worn rug covered part of the plank floor. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books whose spines were cracked from reading. Rhett set down her trunk and gestured toward a hallway. Your room. Elena followed him down the corridor. He opened a door onto a space that was larger than any room she'd rented in the past 5 years. A bed with an iron frame and a patchwork quilt. A dresser with a mirror that had lost some of its silver backing. A window that looked east, just like he'd said, with curtains that someone had hemmed by hand. Thank you, Elena said. He nodded, already turning to leave. Mr. Calder. He stopped, looked back. When you sent for me, Elena said carefully, you said there would be a minister. I assume you meant for a wedding. That's right. When? 3 days. That gives you time to settle. Change your mind if you need to. Elena almost laughed, as if she had somewhere else to go, as if she'd come all this way on a whim she could reverse. I won't change my mind. His gaze held hers, searching for something, doubt maybe, or fear. Neither will I. It wasn't a romantic declaration. It was a commitment, hard and binding as any contract signed in ink. Elena understood that language. Then I'll be ready, she said. He left without another word. Elena stood alone in the room that would be hers, at least until she gave Rhett Calder what he wanted. Then what? Another room? The same arrangement, maintained at a careful distance? She supposed she'd find out. She unpacked slowly, methodically, hanging her 3 dresses in the wardrobe, arranging her hairbrush and pins on the dresser, placing Whitman on the small table beside the bed. Each item claimed a small piece of space, marked this room as occupied, if not quite home. The window drew her. She stood looking out at the sprawling land, the mountains beyond, the sky that went on forever. Somewhere in Philadelphia, her former landlady was renting out Elena's old room. Somewhere in Kansas, the school had hired a replacement teacher, probably younger, probably willing to work for less. Elena's life had compressed down to what fit in a trunk, and now even that was scattered across an unfamiliar room in a place so remote that help, if she ever needed it, was hours away. She should have felt afraid. Instead, she felt something closer to relief. A knock on the door frame made her turn. Rhett stood there, not quite entering. Dinner's in an hour. There's stew left from yesterday. It just needs heating. I'll take care of it. Kitchen's through there. He gestured vaguely. Everything you need should be there. If it's not, make a list. All right. He hesitated, and for the first time, Elena saw something crack in that controlled exterior. Just a flash of uncertainty, quickly shuddered. You didn't ask questions. In your letters. Most women would have asked more. What would have been the point? Elena said. You were clear about what you wanted. Either I could provide it, or I couldn't. Either I was willing, or I wasn't. And you were willing. I was practical. Practical. He tested the word like he wasn't sure it fit. Is that what you call it? What would you call it? Desperate. Elena stiffened, but Rhett's expression hadn't changed. No mockery, no judgment, just that same unflinching directness. Maybe, she admitted, but desperation doesn't make the decision wrong. No, he agreed. It doesn't. He turned to leave, then paused. Elena. It was the first time he'd used her given name. It sounded strange in his rough voice, too intimate for the careful distance they were maintaining. Yes? This arrangement. It's not a prison. If you decide you can't go through with it, I'll pay your passage to wherever you want to go. No questions. She should have been grateful. It was more than most men would offer. But something in his tone rankled, as if he expected her to bolt, as if he thought she hadn't understood what she was agreeing to. I don't need an escape clause, Elena said coolly. I knew what I was doing when I got on that stagecoach. I know what I'm doing now. Rhett studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. Good. This time when he left, Elena didn't call him back. The next 3 days passed in a strange rhythm, not comfortable, but not hostile either. Elena learned the kitchen, the house, the unspoken schedule that governed Rhett's days. He rose before dawn, worked until dark, came in only for meals. He wasn't talkative, but he wasn't unkind. He answered her questions about the ranch, showed her where things were stored, fixed a squeaking hinge on the pantry door without being asked. They were like two strangers sharing a stage on a long journey, polite, careful, aware that they'd be in close quarters for an indefinite time, and therefore invested in not making each other miserable. Elena explored the house when Rhett was working. The books on the shelves were an odd collection, agricultural manuals, a few novels, poetry that surprised her. She found Tennyson, Longfellow, even some Byron, evidence of a mind that hadn't always been this closed off. On the second day, she found photographs in a drawer, a stern-faced couple who had to be Rhett's parents, a younger Rhett with something almost like lightness in his expression, and tucked in the back, a woman with dark hair and a tentative smile, wearing a dress too fine for ranch life. Elena didn't ask about the woman. Some questions invited ghosts into the room, and there were already enough of those. The minister arrived on the third day, just after noon. Reverend Miller was older, weathered by frontier life, carrying a Bible whose cover had been repaired with careful stitches. He looked at Elena with eyes that had seen too many hurried weddings to be shocked by one more. "You're certain about this, Miss Ward?" he asked while Rhett was out harnessing the horses. "Yes." "It's not too late to reconsider." "I'm not reconsidering." He sighed, a sound full of resignation. "Then let's proceed." The ceremony took place in the main room, with 2 ranch hands pulled in as witnesses, men who looked uncomfortable in clean shirts, shifting their weight and avoiding Elena's eyes. The words were familiar, handed down through centuries of tradition, binding 2 people who barely knew each other into a contract that law and custom would enforce. Rhett's voice was steady when he spoke his vows. Elena's didn't waver either. When the Reverend pronounced them married, there was no kiss. Rhett offered his hand instead, and Elena shook it like they'd just concluded a business arrangement, which, she supposed, they had. The witnesses fled as soon as they could. The Reverend accepted payment, offered stiff congratulations, and left. And then it was just the 2 of them standing in the main room while afternoon light slanted through the windows. "Well," Rhett said. "Well," Elena echoed. "Nothing changes yet." He said it quickly, like he'd been planning the words. "You keep your room. I'll keep mine. When you're ready, if you're ready, you let me know." Elena blinked, surprised despite herself. She'd expected, well, she wasn't sure what she'd expected, but not consideration, not this careful distance. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "It's the right way to do things." "Is it? Most men wouldn't think so." "I'm not most men." "No," Elena said, really seeing him for maybe the first time. "You're not." Something passed between them. Not attraction, not yet, but recognition. An acknowledgement that they were both trying to navigate this strange territory with something resembling decency. "I've got work," Rhett said, breaking the moment. "I'll be in until dark." I'll have dinner ready. He left, and Elena stood alone in the house that was now legally hers as much as his. Mrs. Rhett Calder. The name felt like a coat that didn't quite fit, but she'd worn ill-fitting things before. You got used to them eventually. She went to the kitchen and started preparing a meal for her husband, because that's what wives did, and if she was going to play this role, she'd play it properly. The stew bubbled on the stove, bread rose in the warming oven. Outside, she could hear the distant sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing, horses moving, the rhythmic crack of an axe splitting wood. This was her life now. Not the life she'd imagined as a girl, when the world still seemed full of possibility, but maybe a life she could survive, maybe even one she could build something from, if she was careful and smart and didn't make the mistake of wanting more than what had been promised. When Rhett came in for dinner, he'd washed up, changed his shirt. He sat across from her at the table, and they ate in companionable silence. It wasn't warmth, but it wasn't coldness either. It was something in between, a truce maybe, or the beginning of an understanding. "The food's good," he said. "Thank you." "Better than I expected." Elena raised an eyebrow. "You expected it to be bad." "I didn't expect anything. That way I couldn't be disappointed." It was the most personal thing he'd said to her, and Elena realized it was also true of more than just cooking. Rhett Calder had built his life around not expecting, not hoping, not leaving himself vulnerable to disappointment. She understood that. She'd done the same thing. "Smart," she said. He glanced up, met her eyes. For a second, something almost like humor flickered there. "We'll see." After dinner, Elena cleaned while Rhett disappeared into his study. She could hear him moving around in there, papers rustling, the scratch of a pen, managing his empire, keeping the accounts, making sure everything ran exactly as it should. She finished the dishes and stood at the window, looking out at darkness broken only by lamplight from the bunkhouse. Stars were appearing, more than she'd ever seen in any city, scattered across the sky like spilled salt. Somewhere out there, the land went on for miles. Empty. Waiting. Full of promise and threat in equal measure. Elena touched her wedding ring, plain gold, neither too tight nor too loose. Rhett had produced it from his pocket like he'd been carrying it for weeks, waiting for this day. It was real, solid, undeniable. She was married, and for better or worse, she was exactly where she'd chosen to be. The first week of marriage passed like water over stone. Present, constant, leaving barely a mark. Elena learned the rhythms of the ranch the way she'd learned everything else in her life, by watching, listening, and keeping her questions sharp and few. She woke before dawn because Rhett did, made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and had breakfast ready when he came in from checking the horses. They ate across from each other, the table a neutral territory neither tried to claim. He was gone most days until the light failed. She filled the hours with work, cleaning rooms that were already clean, mending clothes that didn't really need mending, teaching herself the temperament of the cast-iron stove that burned hotter on the left side. The cook, Mrs. Jensen, came on Tuesday and regarded Elena with the suspicious neutrality of someone who'd seen hired women come and go. She left a venison roast, 2 loaves of bread, and instructions delivered in clipped sentences that didn't invite conversation. Elena didn't push. She'd learned that acceptance came slow out here, if it came at all. On the 8th day, she woke to silence. Not the usual silence of Rhett moving quietly so as not to disturb her, but the heavy silence of absence. She dressed quickly and found the house empty, the coffee unmade, Rhett's coat missing from its peg. Outside, the sky was the color of old pewter. Wind came from the north, carrying the smell of weather. Elena wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and walked toward the barn, her boots crunching on frost-hardened ground. She found him in one of the far corrals, working a young horse on a long lead line. The animal was wild-eyed and fighting, crow-hopping and throwing its head, but Rhett's hand stayed steady on the rope. He didn't pull, didn't yank, just maintained constant pressure and waited. Elena leaned against the fence and watched. There was something hypnotic about it, the contest of wills playing out in a space no bigger than a room. The horse would bolt to the end of the line, hit resistance, whirl and try another direction. Each time, Rhett was there, immovable. "He'll break himself if he keeps that up," Elena said. Rhett didn't turn, but his shoulders shifted, acknowledging her presence without welcoming it. "He'll figure it out." "How long have you been out here?" "Since 4. 3 hours, then." Elena did the math. Without coffee? I've done without before. The horse made another desperate lunge. Rhett absorbed the shock through his legs and back, his boots planted firm in the dirt. What happens if he doesn't figure it out? Elena asked. Then he's not worth keeping. It was a harsh assessment, delivered without emotion. Elena wondered if Rhett applied the same standard to people. If he was watching her the same way he watched this horse, waiting to see if she'd panic and bolt or settle into the weight of the rope. Breakfast is ready when you are, she said. I'll be another hour. Elena nodded and turned back toward the house. Behind her, she heard Rhett's voice, low and steady, talking to the horse in words she couldn't make out. Not commands exactly. Something closer to negotiation. She made eggs and salt pork, kept them warm on the back of the stove. When Rhett finally came in, his hands were raw from rope burn, and his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cold. He washed at the basin, scrubbing his forearms with lye soap that had to sting, then sat heavily in his chair. Elena set food in front of him without comment. He ate like a man who'd earned the meal, methodical and efficient. When he finished, he pushed back from the table and looked at her directly for the first time that morning. You don't have to wait on me. I know. I mean it. If I'm late, eat without me. Don't let good food go cold on my account. Elena met his gaze. And if I choose to wait? His jaw tightened. Why would you? Because it's civilized. Because sitting down to a meal together is one of the few normal things about this arrangement. Take your pick. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe? Or the beginning of respect. You're not what I expected. You've said that before. I mean it more now. Elena carried the plates to the basin, giving herself something to do with her hands. What did you expect exactly? Some simpering girl who'd faint at the sight of blood? A woman so desperate she'd agree to anything? Yes, Rhett said bluntly. Both of those. At least he was honest. Elena scrubbed at a plate harder than necessary. Well, I'm neither. I don't faint, and I agreed to this with my eyes open. If that's disappointing, it's not. He stood, crossing to where she worked. Not close enough to crowd her, but close enough that she could smell horse and leather and the clean scent of lye soap. It's better. Elena's hands stilled in the water. Better for what? For what I need. He said it carefully, like he was picking through a field of buried traps. A partner who can handle herself, who doesn't need coddling or protecting from reality. Is that what this is? Elena turned to face him, water dripping from her fingers. A partnership? It could be. I thought it was a transaction. Maybe it's both. They stood like that, the morning light cutting through the window between them. Elena could see the lines around Rhett's eyes, the weathering that came from years of sun and wind and hard choices. There was a scar along his jawline she hadn't noticed before, old and white. Did the horse settle? She asked. The change of subject was deliberate, a retreat from territory that felt suddenly dangerous. Rhett accepted it, stepping back. Starting to. He's got spirit, but he's got sense, too. He'll come around. And if he doesn't, then I'll sell him to someone with more patience than brains. Rhett grabbed his hat from the peg. I'm riding fence line today, north pasture. I'll be back before dark. I'll have dinner ready. He paused at the door. Elena. Yes? You did good with the eggs. Better than the cook makes them. It was a small thing, barely a compliment, but something warm unfurled in Elena's chest anyway. Thank you. After he left, she stood at the window and watched him ride out, his silhouette growing smaller against the enormous sky. The house felt bigger in his absence, emptier. She'd gotten used to solitude over the years, sought it out even, after too many boarding houses where privacy was a luxury, but this was different. This was the solitude of waiting, of existing in the pause between one thing and the next. She forced herself into motion. The house needed attention even if it didn't look like it. She swept floors that didn't need sweeping, beat rugs that held no dust, reorganized the pantry by size and type until everything stood in perfect rows. Work was familiar. Work she understood. Around noon, she made bread. The physical labor of kneading settled something in her chest, the rhythm of push and fold, until the dough transformed from sticky mess to smooth elasticity. She left it to rise and went exploring through the parts of the house she'd avoided. Rhett's study was off limits, but the door stood open and Elena paused in the hallway, looking in without entering. The room was sparse, a desk with neat stacks of ledgers, a chair worn smooth by use, shelves holding books on animal husbandry and land management. A map of the territory covered one wall, marked with notations in Rhett's angular handwriting. Everything organized, everything controlled. She moved on to the other rooms, found a parlor that looked unused, furniture covered with sheets, a bedroom that had to have been his parents', the bed made up, but the air stale. And at the end of the hall, a room she'd assumed was storage. The door stuck when she tried it, swollen from disuse. Elena put her shoulder into it, and the door gave way suddenly, spilling her into a space filled with afternoon light. It had been a woman's room. That much was clear from the delicate furniture. A vanity with an oval mirror, a wardrobe with carved doors, a sewing table positioned near the window. But everything was covered in dust so thick it looked like snow. Whoever had lived here was long gone, and no one had bothered to pack away the remnants. Elena moved slowly through the space, her footsteps leaving prints on the floor. The wardrobe held dresses, outdated in style, expensive in fabric. The vanity drawer contained hairpins and ribbons, a comb with several teeth missing. On the sewing table, a piece of embroidery sat half-finished, the needle still threaded with blue silk. This was the woman from the photograph, the one with the tentative smile and the too fine dress. This had been her space, her things, her life, abandoned so completely it was like she'd simply evaporated. "You shouldn't be in here," Elena spun around. Rhett stood in the doorway, his expression locked down tight. "I'm sorry," Elena said. "The door was unlocked, and I thought, you thought wrong." His voice was flat, carefully emotionless. "This room stays closed." Who was she? No one you need to know about. "I'm living in this house," Elena said, keeping her voice level. "If there's something I should understand, there's not." Rhett stepped into the room, and for the first time since Elena had arrived, he looked truly angry. Not the hot anger that burned out quick, but the cold kind that lasted. "This is my house, my rules. I told you the study was private. I should have told you this room was too." "You should have." Elena didn't back down, didn't look away. "If you have shrines you're maintaining, I need to know where they are so I don't disturb them." His jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscle jump. "Get out." Elena walked past him, close enough to feel the heat of his anger radiating like a fever. She went back to the kitchen, to the bread that had risen and now needed punching down. Her hands were shaking when she plunged them into the dough, but she forced them steady. She'd crossed a line, she understood that. But Rhett had lines everywhere, invisible boundaries she was supposed to intuit without being told. How was she supposed to navigate a place where the rules kept changing? He didn't come in for dinner. Elena ate alone, the silence of the house pressing down like a physical weight. She cleaned up, banked the fire, and retreated to her room as soon as it was dark enough to justify it. She lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night. Somewhere, a horse whinnied. Wind rattled the shutters. And beneath it all, the heavy quiet of a man who'd built walls so high, even he couldn't see over them anymore. The next morning, Rhett was gone before dawn again. No coffee made, no note left. Elena found him in the barn, mucking out stalls with violent efficiency. "I'll have breakfast ready in 20 minutes, she said from the doorway. He didn't look up. "Not hungry." "You need to eat." "I'll eat when I'm ready." Elena crossed her arms. "Is this how it's going to be? You get angry and disappear? Refuse to talk like a grown man?" That got his attention. He straightened, pitchfork in hand, and the look he gave her could have stripped bark off a tree. "You want to talk? Fine. Let's talk about boundaries. Let's talk about respecting someone's privacy instead of pawing through their things like—" "I wasn't pawing through anything," Elena cut in, her own anger rising to meet his. "I was exploring the house I'm supposed to live in, and I found a room that's clearly a memorial to someone you won't mention. You want privacy? Lock the damn door." "I shouldn't have to lock doors in my own house." "Our house," Elena shot back. "Ishami, you married me, remember? Put a ring on my finger and a roof over my head. That makes it my house too, even if you'd rather pretend I'm just passing through." Rhett's knuckles were white on the pitchfork handle. "You don't know anything about it." "Because you won't tell me. You want me to navigate this place blind, follow rules you won't explain, and stay out of rooms you won't identify. That's not a partnership, Rhett. That's servitude with extra steps." "Then maybe you should leave." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and cutting. Elena felt them land, felt the sting, but she didn't flinch. Maybe I should, she said quietly. But I won't, because I made a commitment, and I keep my commitments even when they're hard. Even when the person on the other side acts like a wounded animal instead of a man. She turned and walked out before he could respond, her spine straight and her hands clenched into fists. She was scrubbing this kitchen floor, taking her anger out on non-existent dirt, when Rhett came in an hour later. He stood in the doorway, hat in hands, looking uncomfortable in a way she'd never seen. Her name was Catherine, he said. Elena sat back on her heels, brush dripping soapy water. We were engaged 6 years ago. She came from back east, Boston. Her father had business with the territory governor, and she thought the frontier would be romantic. His mouth twisted. It wasn't. She hated everything about it. The isolation, the work, the wind. But she stayed because I asked her to, because I promised her it would get easier. He moved into the room, pulled out a chair, sat like the weight of the story was too much to carry standing. 3 months before the wedding, she left. Didn't tell me she was going, just packed her things and took the stage back to Boston. Left a note saying she couldn't do it. Couldn't be the kind of woman this life required. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred. I kept her room the way it was, told myself I'd pack it up eventually, but eventually never came. Elena set down the brush. I'm sorry. Don't be. She made the right choice. This life. He gestured vaguely at the world outside the walls. It's not for everyone. It breaks people who aren't strong enough. Is that what you're worried about? Elena asked. That I'll break too? I'm not worried about anything. I learned my lesson. Don't expect, don't hope, don't trust that anyone will stay. And yet you sent for me. Because I needed an heir, not a wife. There's a difference. The bluntness should have hurt. Maybe it would have, if Elena hadn't already understood exactly what she'd signed up for. I know there's a difference. I'm not here for romance either. No? No. She picked up the brush again, went back to scrubbing. I'm here because I was tired of being alone, tired of teaching other people's children while having none of my own, tired of rented rooms and temporary positions, and knowing that every year I got older made me less valuable on a market I never wanted to be part of in the first place. Rhett was quiet for a long moment. That's honest. It's the truth. Elena scrubbed harder. You're not the only one who knows how to manage expectations. I suppose not. She glanced up, found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I won't go in that room again, but I won't apologize for walking through an unlocked door in a house I'm supposed to belong to. Fair enough? He stood, settled his hat back on his head. And I'll stop acting like you're going to bolt at the first sign of difficulty. That would be appreciated. He almost smiled. Almost. Breakfast still available? If you don't mind it cold. I've had worse. They ate together in a silence that felt different from the careful politeness of before. Something had shifted, a foundation settling into place. Not friendship exactly, not trust, but maybe the beginning of something that could become those things, given time. After breakfast, Rhett disappeared into his study. Elena heard the scratch of his pen, the rustle of ledger pages. She finished cleaning the kitchen and then, because she was tired of staying inside, pulled on her cloak and went outside. The cold hit her immediately, sharp and clean. Winter was coming. She could feel it in the air, see it in the way the horses grew thicker coats and the cattle bunched together in the lee of the hills. She walked to the barn, drawn by curiosity and the need to understand this place better. The young horse Rhett had been working with stood in a corner stall, watching her with wary eyes. Elena approached slowly, keeping her movements calm and predictable. The horse snorted but didn't shy. You're learning, she said softly, figuring out that not everything is a threat. The horse's ears flicked forward, tracking her voice. I know how you feel, Elena continued. New place, new rules, everyone waiting to see if you'll measure up. She held out her hand, let the horse smell her skin. It's exhausting, isn't it, being tested all the time? He can't understand you. Elena didn't jump, though Rhett's voice had come from directly behind her. Maybe not the words, but he understands the tone. Rhett moved to stand beside her, and the horse's attention shifted to him immediately. He's calming down. Another week and I'll be able to saddle him. What's his name? Doesn't have one yet? No point naming something until you know it's worth keeping. Elena looked at him. That's a lonely way to live. It's a practical way. Practical and lonely aren't mutually exclusive. Rhett's mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. They stood there, two people separated by more than just physical distance, and watched the horse settle into its corner. I need to ride out to the south pasture tomorrow, Rhett said eventually. Check on the herd before the weather turns. I'll be gone most of the day. All right. You'll be here alone. Mrs. Jensen won't come until Tuesday. I've been alone before. Not like this. Not this isolated. Elena turned to face him fully. Are you trying to warn me or scare me? Neither. Just making sure you understand. I understand perfectly. She pulled her cloak tighter against the cold. I'm not fragile, Rhett. I'm not Catherine. I won't run just because things get hard. His eyes searched hers, looking for cracks, for doubt. You say that now. I'll say it tomorrow too, and the day after that. However many times you need to hear it before you believe it. Something in his expression softened, just a fraction. You're stubborn. So are you. Then we're well matched. It wasn't a declaration of affection. It was an observation, clinical and detached. But it was also the closest thing to approval Rhett had offered, and Elena found herself accepting it for what it was. That night she made stew from the venison Mrs. Jensen had left, thick with root vegetables and seasoned with herbs she'd found growing wild near the spring. Rhett came in late, his face windburned and his hands stiff with cold. He ate 2 bowls and complimented the cooking without being prompted. They fell into a pattern after that. Not easy, not comfortable, but functional. Rhett worked the ranch with the single-minded intensity of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. Elena managed the house, learned to bake bread that didn't turn into bricks, and spent her evenings reading by lamplight while Rhett went over his accounts. Sometimes they talked. Small exchanges about the weather, the horses, supplies that needed ordering. Other times they existed in silence, each aware of the other but not requiring interaction. It was a marriage of proximity, not intimacy, and for the first few weeks that seemed like enough. But the nights were getting longer and winter was coming fast. The temperature dropped hard in the 3rd week, frost giving way to ice giving way to the first real snow. Elena woke one morning to a world transformed, white and silent and so bright it hurt to look at. She found Rhett in the barn already feeding the horses. How much did we get? She asked. 4 inches. More coming tonight. Is that normal? For October? No, but normal doesn't mean much out here. He tossed hay into the last stall. We need to bring in extra firewood. Stock the pantry. Once the deep snow hits, we could be stuck here for weeks. Elena nodded, filing away the information. Tell me what needs doing. He did. They worked through the morning, Elena hauling wood while Rhett checked the outbuildings and moved the cattle closer to the winter pasture. By noon, her back ached and her hands were raw despite the gloves. But the woodshed was full, the pantry stocked, and she'd earned the exhaustion honestly. They ate lunch in the kitchen, both too tired to bother with the dining room. You didn't complain once, Rhett observed. Would complaining have helped? No. Then why waste the energy? He studied her over the rim of his coffee cup. Most women would have at least mentioned that it's hard work. It is hard work. But so is teaching 30 children who don't want to learn arithmetic. So is scrubbing floors for landlords who charge extra if you want hot water. Everything's hard. You just pick which hard you can live with. Rhett set down his cup. And you can live with this? I'm still here, aren't I? For now. Elena felt a flash of irritation. How long are you going to keep waiting for me to leave? I'm not. Yes, you are. Every time you look at me, I can see you measuring the distance to the door, calculating how long before I crack. She stood, carried her plate to the basin. I'm not going anywhere, Rhett. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will get. You can't know that. Neither can you. The argument hung there, unfinished, while they cleaned up in silence. But that night, when Elena went to her room, she found a new quilt on her bed, heavier than the one before, the stitching careful and precise. No note, no explanation. Just the quiet acknowledgement that winter was coming and she'd need warmth. It was the kind of gesture Rhett would make. Practical, unspoken, easy to deny if questioned. But Elena ran her fingers over the stitches and felt something shift in her chest anyway. Maybe this marriage wasn't what she'd imagined. Maybe it never would be. But it was becoming something, a foundation being built one careful stone at a time. And for the first time since arriving, Elena let herself hope that the foundation might hold. The snow came heavier as November settled in, transforming the ranch into something isolated and absolute. The world beyond the property line ceased to exist. No visitors, no supply runs, just Elena and Rhett, and the endless work of keeping things alive through the cold. They fell into a rhythm born of necessity, their conversation stripped down to essentials. Pass the salt, check the horses. Storms coming in from the north. But something was changing beneath the surface. Small shifts Elena felt more than saw. The way Rhett's eyes would linger on her when he thought she wasn't looking. The way his hand would brush hers when they both reached for the coffee pot. Contact that lasted a fraction too long to be accidental. The way the silence between them had started to feel charged, like the air before lightning. Elena tried to ignore it. She'd come here with clear eyes and realistic expectations, and getting tangled up in feelings that weren't part of the agreement seemed like the fastest way to ruin what little stability they'd built. But her body didn't listen to logic. She found herself noticing things she shouldn't. The way Rhett's shoulders moved when he split wood, the rare moments when his face relaxed into something almost peaceful, the sound of his voice in the dark when he talked to the horses. It was the third week of November when everything started to fracture. Elena had been baking bread and biscuits to replace what they'd eaten through, the kitchen warm and flour-dusted. When Rhett came in early, his face tight with the kind of frustration he usually kept locked down. "Lost 3 head," he said, shrugging out of his coat. "Found them in the ravine past the north fence. Broke through the ice." Elena set down the dough she'd been kneading. "I'm sorry. It's not your fault." He poured himself coffee, drank it black and too hot. "It's mine. Should have moved them closer before the freeze set in hard." "You can't predict everything. I can predict most things. That's the job." He set the cup down harder than necessary. 3 head might not sound like much, but that's money we won't have come spring. Breeding stock I can't replace easily. Elena wiped flour from her hands. "What can I do?" "Nothing. There's nothing to do except write it down in the loss column and move on." But he didn't move on. He stood there staring at the cup in his hands, jaw working like he was chewing on words he wouldn't say. Elena had learned to read his moods, the difference between anger that would blow over and the kind that went deep, and this was the deep kind. "It's not just the cattle," she said quietly. His eyes cut to her sharp. "What? You're not this upset over 3 head. Something else is eating at you." "Don't presume to know what I'm thinking." "I'm not presuming. I'm observing." Elena crossed her arms. "You've been wound tight for days, ever since the McAllister boy came by with that message from town." Rhett's expression shuddered. "That's none of your concern. We're married. That makes most things my concern." "We're married on paper. Don't confuse that with something it's not." The words landed like a slap, but Elena held her ground. "Fine. Keep your secrets. But don't take your frustration out on me just because I'm the only one here." She turned back to the bread dough, kneading harder than necessary. Behind her, she heard Rhett exhale slowly. "The bank's raising interest rates," he said. "The loan I took out 3 years ago to expand the herd. They're changing the terms. Want an extra 2% starting January." Elena's hand stilled. "Can you afford that? If we have a good calving season, if the market holds, if winter doesn't drag on too long." He laughed, bitter. "Too many ifs." "How much do you need?" "More than I have." He moved to the window, stared out at the white expanse. "I put everything into this place. Every dollar, every hour. Built it from nothing into something that could sustain a family. And now some banker back east decides he wants more. And there's not a damn thing I can do about it except pay or lose it all." Elena processed this, understanding clicking into place. The advertisement. The urgency. The specific request for a woman who could bear children quickly. He hadn't just wanted an heir for legacy, he'd needed one for leverage. A family meant stability, meant the bank would be less likely to call in the loan if things went south. "That's why you sent for me," she said. "Not just for a child, for insurance." Rhett's shoulders tensed, but he didn't deny it. "I told you from the start what this was." "You told me you wanted an heir. You didn't tell me you needed one to save your ranch." "Would it have changed your answer?" Elena considered that. "No, but I would have appreciated knowing the full picture." "The full picture is this. I'm 42 years old. I've worked this land for 20 years, and I'll be damned if I let some banker take it because he wants to squeeze more profit out of people who are already bleeding. Rhett turned from the window. You want honesty? Fine. I married you because I needed a wife and a child to present to the bank board. Proof that I'm building something permanent, something worth their investment. Without that, they'll call the loan. With it, I have a chance. And if I don't get pregnant, then we're both in trouble because I'll lose this place and you'll have nowhere to go. The bluntness was almost refreshing. No softening, no apologies. Just the raw truth laid out like a hand of cards. How long do we have? Elena asked. 6 months? They want to review the loan in April. Elena did the math. Even if she conceived tonight, she wouldn't be showing much by April, but the fact of pregnancy would be enough. Proof that Rhett was serious about building a dynasty instead of just holding on to dirt. Then we have a problem, she said, because this arrangement you wanted, separate rooms, taking our time, that doesn't work with a 6-month deadline. Rhett's gaze locked on hers, and Elena saw the conflict there. The war between what he'd promised and what he needed. I won't force you, he said. I know. But I also know what's at stake now. Elena wiped her hands on her apron, made herself meet his eyes directly. You need a child and I agreed to give you one. The timeline just moved up. That's all. That's not all. Rhett crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, stopping close enough that Elena had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. Don't make it sound simple. Don't pretend there's no difference between doing this because you're ready and doing it because a bank gave me a deadline. Isn't that what marriage is for most people? Doing things because circumstances require it rather than because you feel like it? Maybe, but I won't have you hating me for it after. Elena almost laughed. Rhett, I came here knowing exactly what would be expected of me. The only thing that's changed is the urgency. If you're asking whether I'm willing to uphold my end of our agreement, the answer is yes. Just like that? Just like that. He searched her face, looking for hesitation or fear. Elena kept her expression neutral, even though her heart was beating hard enough to hurt. When? He asked, voice rough. Whenever you want. That's not an answer. Elena took a breath. Tonight, then. After dinner. We'll do what we agreed to do, and we'll stop dancing around it. Rhett's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might argue, might insist they wait despite the deadline crushing down on both of them. But he just nodded once, sharp and final. Tonight, he agreed. He left, and Elena stood in the kitchen surrounded by half-finished bread and the smell of yeast, her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the counter to steady them. She'd made it sound easy, clinical, like they were discussing crop rotation instead of the irrevocable change about to happen between them. But her body knew better. Her pulse hammered in her throat, and heat crawled up her neck despite the cool air. She'd been with a man before, once, years ago, a mistake that taught her the difference between what books promised and what reality delivered. It hadn't been cruel, but it hadn't been kind either. Just awkward and uncomfortable and over quickly, leaving her with nothing but regret and the certain knowledge that romance was a story other people got to live. This would be different. This was an agreement entered into with clear minds. No false promises, no lies about feelings that didn't exist. Just 2 people meeting the terms of a contract. She repeated that to herself while she finished the bread, while she cooked dinner, while she set the table with hands that wouldn't quite stay steady. Rhett came in at the usual time, washed up at the basin, and sat down across from her. They ate in silence, the scrape of forks against plates the only sound. Elena had made roast chicken, potatoes, the last of the preserved green beans, good solid food that neither of them tasted. It doesn't have to be tonight, Rhett said halfway through the meal. Yes, it does. Elena set down her fork. The longer we wait, the harder it gets. Best to just do it and be done with the anticipation. You make it sound like pulling a tooth. Isn't it? Rhett's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. I've had better comparisons. I'm sure you have. Elena stood, started clearing plates even though they'd barely touched the food. I'll clean up. You should, I don't know, do whatever you need to do to prepare. Elena. She stopped, her back to him. This doesn't have to be something you endure, Rhett said quietly. I know what we agreed to, but I'm not an animal. I can try to make it less difficult. Elena turned to look at him. He was still sitting at the table, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. uncertain in a way that made him seem younger, more vulnerable. "I appreciate that," she said, "but we both know this isn't about pleasure or connection. It's about biology and necessity. Let's not pretend otherwise." Something flashed in his eyes. Hurt, maybe, or disappointment. But he just nodded and stood, carrying his plate to the basin. They cleaned up together in silence. Elena was hyper-aware of every movement, every time their hands came close to touching. The air felt thick, hard to breathe. When the last dish was dried and put away, there was nothing left to delay with. "I'll be in my room," Elena said. "Give me 10 minutes. She didn't wait for his response, just walked down the hallway with her spine straight and her hands clenched into fists. Inside her room, she closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. She could do this. She'd survived worse, teaching jobs that paid starvation wages, landlords who got too familiar. The slow, grinding knowledge that her life was narrowing down to nothing. This was just another thing to survive, and on the other side would be security, a child, a place to belong. Elena changed into her nightdress, plain white cotton, nothing fancy, and braided her hair to keep it out of the way. She turned down the bed, checked that the lamp was burning low, tried not to think about what was about to happen, and failed completely. The knock on her door came exactly 10 minutes later. "Come in," she said. Red entered, still dressed but with his boots off and his shirt collar unbuttoned. He looked as uncomfortable as Elena felt, which was oddly reassuring. At least they were both floundering. He closed the door behind him. The click of the latch sounded final. "We don't have to do this," he said again. "Stop saying that." Elena sat on the edge of the bed. "We made an agreement. I'm not backing out." "Are you?" "No." "Then stop giving me exits I'm not going to take." Rhett crossed the room slowly, giving her time to change her mind even though he'd just said he wouldn't. He sat beside her on the bed, not touching, the mattress dipping under his weight. "I haven't—" He stopped, started again. "It's been a long time for me. Since Catherine left. I'm not sure I remember how to be gentle about this. I don't need gentle. I need honest. I can do honest." Elena looked at him, really looked, taking in the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the scar along his jaw she'd never asked about. He was a hard man, worn down by work and disappointment and the brutal honesty of frontier life. But he'd been decent to her, fair, in his way. That had to count for something. "Then be honest," she said. "Don't pretend this is something it's not. Don't try to make it romantic or meaningful. Just do what needs doing." Rhett's hand came up, cupped her face. His palm was rough against her skin, warm. "You deserve better than that." "Maybe, but that's not what I signed up for." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his mouth brushed hers, tentative, testing. Elena closed her eyes and let it happen. Let herself feel the unfamiliar pressure of lips against hers, the scratch of stubble, the taste of coffee. It wasn't unpleasant. It wasn't anything, really, just a kiss, mechanical and careful. Rhett pulled back. "You're shaking." "I'm fine." "You're not." He stood abruptly, ran a hand through his hair. "This is wrong. You're scared. I'm pushing you." "You're not pushing me." Elena stood too, frustration overriding nerves. "I'm shaking because this is new and strange, and I'm trying very hard to pretend I know what I'm doing when I don't. But that doesn't mean I want to stop." "Why not?" Because if we stop now, we'll just have to do this again tomorrow night, and the night after that, and every night we'll both be thinking about it, building it up until it becomes this impossible thing we can't get past." She moved closer to him. "I want it done, Rhett. I want it over so we can move forward instead of staying stuck in this waiting." He stared at her, breathing hard. Then something in his expression shifted, determination replacing doubt. "All right," he said, "but if you change your mind, if you need me to stop, I'll tell you. Promise me." "I promise." Rhett kissed her again, and this time there was less hesitation. His hands found her waist, pulled her closer. Elena's brain tried to catalog sensations, the heat of him, the strength in his arms, the way his mouth moved against hers, but it all blurred together into overwhelming sensation. He guided her back to the bed, his weight settling over her, and Elena forced herself to breathe, to stay present, to not drift away into the disconnection that had saved her before. This mattered. This was the beginning of something, even if she didn't know yet what that something would be. Rhett's hands were careful, his movements measured. He was trying, she realized, trying to make this less clinical, less like the transaction they'd both insisted it was. Part of her wanted to tell him to stop trying, to just get it over with. But another part, a part she'd thought she'd killed years ago, appreciated the effort. It still hurt. Not terribly, not unbearably, but enough that Elena had to bite her lip to keep from making a sound. Rhett stilled immediately. "I'm hurting you. It's fine. It's not, Rhett." She opened her eyes, found him looking down at her with concern that made her chest tight. "I'm fine. This is normal. Just keep going." He did, but gentler now, watching her face for signs of pain, and gradually, impossibly, the hurt began to ease. Not into pleasure, she wasn't naive enough to expect that, but into something bearable, something she could survive. When it was over, Rhett rolled away immediately, putting space between them. Elena lay still, staring at the ceiling, feeling the unfamiliar ache and the dampness and the strange knowledge that something irrevocable had just happened. "Are you all right?" Rhett asked quietly. "Yes." I tried not to." "I know." Elena pulled the blanket up, suddenly cold. "You were as careful as you could be." Silence settled between them, heavy and awkward. Elena wanted him to leave, wanted to be alone to process what had just happened. But she also didn't want to be alone, didn't want to lie in the dark with only her thoughts for company. Rhett solved the problem by standing, pulling his clothes back into order. "I should go." "All right." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Elena." "Yes?" "Thank you." She almost laughed at the absurdity of thanking someone for fulfilling a contract. But his voice was sincere, and she understood what he was really saying. "Thank you for not making this harder than it had to be. Thank you for not crying or flinching or treating him like a monster." "You're welcome," she said. He left, and Elena was alone. She lay in the dark, feeling the residual ache between her legs and the strange hollowness in her chest. It was done. The first time was over, and it hadn't destroyed her. That had to count as a victory, however small. She got up, cleaned herself with the water in the basin, and changed into a fresh nightdress. Then she crawled back into bed and pulled the quilt, the one Rhett had given her, up to her chin. Outside, wind howled around the corners of the house. Inside, Elena closed her eyes and tried not to think about the fact that they'd have to do this again. And again. Until either she conceived or the deadline passed and the bank took everything. She'd known it wouldn't be easy, but knowing and experiencing were different things. Eventually, exhausted by tension and overthinking, Elena slept. The next morning, she woke to find Rhett already gone. Coffee made, fire stoked, a note on the table that said he'd be checking the south fence line and wouldn't be back until afternoon. Elena read the note twice, trying to decide if he was giving her space or avoiding her. Probably both. She went through her morning routine, washing, dressing, starting bread, but everything felt different. Her body moved the same way, but she was aware of it in a way she hadn't been before, aware of the soreness, the changes, the knowledge of what had happened written into her muscles and skin. Mrs. Jensen came at her usual time, bustling in with supplies and her typical tight-lipped efficiency. She looked at Elena sharply, then away, and Elena wondered what showed on her face. But the cook didn't ask questions, just put away groceries and started on a pot of stew that would last the rest of the week. "Storm coming," Mrs. Jensen said. "Big one, if the sky's telling truth." "How big?" "Big enough you'll want everything secured. Animals in, wood stacked close, windows shuttered. Could last days." Elena nodded, filing away the information. "Thank you for the warning," Mrs. Jensen grunted, which was as close to friendly as she got. "Your husband know what he's doing out there?" "I assume so." "Better hope so. Easy to get lost if the snow comes heavy. Seen it happen to men who'd lived here 20 years. The worry must have shown on Elena's face because Mrs. Jensen's expression softened fractionally. "He'll be fine. Rhett Calder's too stubborn to freeze, but you make sure there's hot food ready when he gets back, and extra blankets near the fire." "I will." The cook left after lunch, and Elena spent the afternoon following her instructions. She brought in extra firewood, checked that the shutters were secure, made sure the lamps were filled with oil. The sky darkened early, clouds rolling in from the north in a solid wall of gray. Rhett came back just as the first flakes started to fall. He looked half frozen. his face raw from wind and his hands stiff when he pulled off his gloves. "Storm's here," he said unnecessarily. Elena handed him coffee, watched him wrap both hands around the cup to thaw his fingers. "Mrs. Jensen warned me. Everything's ready." "Good." He drank the coffee in long swallows, then went to check the barn one more time. When he came back, snow was already accumulating in his hair. "It's going to be bad," he said. "We might be stuck inside for days." The implication hung in the air between them, stuck inside, together, with nothing to do but wait out the storm and deal with the awkwardness of what had happened the night before. "We'll manage," Elena said. They ate dinner in near silence, the wind already howling around the house. Outside, the world disappeared into white. Inside, the fire crackled and the lamps burned, and two people who'd become strangers again tried to figure out how to exist in the same space. Rhett went to his study after dinner. Elena cleaned up, then retreated to the main room with a book she couldn't focus on. The words blurred together, her mind circling back to the same thoughts. They'd done it once. They'd have to do it again. How many times before she conceived? How long could they maintain this careful distance while their bodies did what nature intended? She was still sitting there, staring at the same page, when Rhett emerged from his study. "I'm going to bed," he said. "All right." He hesitated, one hand on the doorframe. "About last night? We don't need to talk about it." "I think we do." Elena set down her book. "What is there to say? We both did what we agreed to do. It's done." "It's not done. It needs to happen again." "I know that." "And you're all right with it?" Elena met his gaze. "Do I have a choice?" Rhett's jaw tightened. "You always have a choice." "No, I don't. Neither do you. We made a deal, and now we're living with it." She stood, smoothed her skirt. "If you're asking whether I'm going to make this harder than it has to be, the answer is no. If you're asking whether I enjoyed it, the answer is also no. If you're asking whether I can survive doing it again, the answer is yes." "That's not—" Rhett stopped, exhaled hard. "I don't want you to just survive it." "Then what do you want?" "I don't know." The admission seemed to cost him something, but it shouldn't feel like something we're both enduring. What should it feel like? He didn't have an answer for that. Elena wasn't sure she wanted one. "I'm going to bed too," she said. "Good night, Rhett." She left him standing there and went to her room, closing the door firmly behind her. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, Elena undressed and climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling, wondering how long they could keep doing this careful dance around the truth that they were bound together by necessity and nothing else. The wind screamed, the house creaked, and Elena lay awake, listening to both, and wondered if Rhett was doing the same in his room down the hall. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping them in a world reduced to the dimensions of the house. Snow piled against the windows until the light that filtered through was dim and blue-tinged. The wind didn't stop, just changed pitch, sometimes a low moan, sometimes a shriek that made the shutters rattle. Elena had never experienced isolation like this, the sense that nothing existed beyond these walls. She and Rhett moved around each other like dancers who'd memorized the steps but forgotten the music. Careful, polite, maintaining distance even when the rooms were small and there was nowhere to go. He spent hours in his study, emerging only for meals. She baked bread they didn't need, mended clothes that weren't torn, and read the same book 3 times without retaining a word. On the second night of the storm, Rhett came to her room again. The awkwardness was worse this time because they both knew what to expect. There was no pretense of gentleness, no attempt at connection, just bodies meeting in the dark, biology doing what it was designed to do. When it was over, Rhett left without speaking, and Elena lay alone, feeling emptier than before. The third night, she almost told him not to come. But the deadline loomed, and practicality won over pride. So she let him in, let him do what needed doing, and told herself the hollowness would fade eventually. It didn't. By the time the storm broke, Elena felt scraped raw. Not from the physical act, her body was adjusting, the pain lessening to discomfort and then to nothing, but from the emotional weight of it, the pretending that this was fine, that she could keep her heart separate from what her body was doing. She'd never been good at lying to herself, and this was the biggest lie yet. The morning after the storm cleared, she woke to silence. Real silence, not just the absence of wind. She dressed quickly and found Rhett already outside, shoveling a path to the barn. Snow had drifted against the buildings in waves, some as high as the windowsills. The world was white and blinding under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Elena grabbed a second shovel and started clearing the porch steps. Rhett glanced over but didn't tell her to stop, so she kept working. The physical labor felt good, honest. Her muscles burned, her breath came hard, and for a few hours she could focus on nothing but the repetitive motion of lift and throw. They worked until noon, pausing only to check on the animals and make sure nothing had frozen. The cattle had huddled in the lee of the barn and come through fine. The horses were restless from being cooped up but healthy. The chickens had survived in their coop, though their water had turned to ice and needed replacing. When they finally came inside, both of them were exhausted. Elena made coffee and sandwiches from yesterday's bread. They ate standing up, too tired to bother with sitting. "I need to ride to town," Rhett said. "Check on supplies, see if the road's passable." "When?" "Tomorrow, if the weather holds." Elena nodded, spreading butter on bread with hands that still ached from the shovel. "How long will you be gone?" 2 days, maybe 3. Depends on the roads." He paused. "You'll be alone." "I've been alone before." "Not like this. Not completely isolated." "I'll be fine, Rhett. I'm not going to panic just because you're not here." He studied her for a long moment. "No, I don't suppose you will." There was something in his tone Elena couldn't quite read. Admiration, maybe. Or regret. She didn't ask which. That night he didn't come to her room. Elena lay awake waiting, half relieved and half insulted, wondering if he'd decided she wasn't worth the effort anymore. But when morning came and she found him already loading the wagon, his face was closed off in a way that told her the choice had cost him something. "There's food in the pantry," he said, not looking at her. "Firewood stacked. If anything happens, nothing will happen. If it does, fire 3 shots from the rifle. The hands in the bunkhouse will come." "I know." He climbed onto the wagon, gathered the reins. Then, finally, he looked at her. "Elena." "Yes?" "I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "This isn't how I wanted things to be." "I know that too." He nodded once, then drove off. Elena stood on the porch and watched until the wagon disappeared over the rise, swallowed by distance and white landscape. Then she went inside and tried to figure out what to do with 2 days of solitude she hadn't asked for. She cleaned first, methodically working through every room, not because they needed it, but because it gave her something to do with her hands. She scrubbed floors, beat rugs, washed windows until they gleamed. The physical work quieted her mind, pushed back the thoughts that kept circling like vultures. On the second day, she found herself standing outside Catherine's room again. The door was still unlocked, still slightly swollen in the frame. Elena had promised not to go in, but Rhett wasn't here and the curiosity was eating at her. What kind of woman had Catherine been? What had she seen in Rhett that made her agree to come out here? And what had she seen later that made her leave? Elena pushed the door open. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. Dust thick on every surface, the half-finished embroidery still on the sewing table. But this time, Elena looked closer. The dresses in the wardrobe were expensive but practical, made for someone who expected to work. The books on the shelf were poetry and philosophy, not the romance novels a frivolous woman would choose. And tucked in the back of the vanity drawer, beneath the hairpins and ribbons, was a letter. Elena hesitated, then pulled it out. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded. She unfolded it carefully. The letter was from Catherine to her mother, dated 2 months before she left. Elena read it once, then again, her chest tightening with each word. Catherine wrote about loneliness, about watching Rhett disappear into his work day after day, coming home too tired to talk, too focused on the ranch to notice her. She wrote about feeling like an accessory, something Rhett had acquired because it was expected, not because he wanted her specifically. She wrote about the silence, not peaceful silence, but the kind that pressed down until you couldn't breathe. And she wrote about the slow realization that she would never be enough because what Rhett really loved was this land, and it would always come first. The letter ended with a line that made Elena's throat tight. "I am drowning here, Mama. Not in water, but in absence, in being invisible to the one person who should see me most." Elena folded the letter carefully and put it back where she'd found it. She left the room, closed the door, and went to sit at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she didn't drink. She understood now. Understood why Rhett had locked himself down so completely, why he insisted on keeping everything transactional. He'd tried once to build something real, and the woman he'd chosen had looked at his life and found it insufficient. So he'd learned to expect nothing, to offer nothing, to make sure no one could hurt him that way again. But understanding didn't make it easier. If anything, it made the situation worse. Because Elena could see now that Rhett wasn't just protecting himself, he was protecting her too, in his own broken way. Keeping distance so she wouldn't drown like Catherine had. Maintaining the walls so neither of them would mistake this arrangement for something it could never be. The problem was, Elena was already drowning. Not in absence, but in the slow realization that she wanted more than the deal they'd made. She wanted conversations that went deeper than weather and supply lists. She wanted to know what made him laugh, what kept him awake at night, what he dreamed about before life had worn those dreams down to survival. She wanted to matter to him as more than a means to an end, and that wanting was dangerous because it wasn't part of the agreement. Rhett returned late on the third day, the wagon loaded with supplies. Elena heard him outside, unloading and settling the horses. She had dinner ready, roast chicken, potatoes, carrots from the root cellar. When he came in, he looked exhausted, his face wind-burned and his eyes shadowed. "How was town?" Elena asked. "Fine. Roads were rough but passable." He washed his hands at the basin. "Got everything we needed and some things we didn't but might want later." "Any news?" "The Hendersons lost half their herd in the storm. The McAllisters are talking about selling out, moving back east." He dried his hands on a towel. "The bank manager asked after you." Elena stiffened. "What did you tell him?" "That you were settling in fine, that we're—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "Building something. And he believed you?" "I don't know. I don't care." Rhett sat at the table, accepted the plate she offered. Their opinion doesn't change what needs to happen. They ate in silence. Elena wanted to ask what he meant by that, but she was afraid of the answer. After dinner, Rhett disappeared into his study as usual. Elena cleaned up, banked the fire, and went to her room expecting another night of lying awake. The knock came around 10. Elena had been sitting on her bed, fully clothed, trying to convince herself to undress and sleep. She opened the door to find Rhett standing there, still dressed as well, looking uncomfortable. "Can I come in?" he asked. It was the first time he'd asked permission. Elena stepped aside. Rhett entered but didn't move toward the bed. Instead, he stood near the window, staring out at the darkness. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About this." He gestured vaguely between them. "About what we're doing and how we're doing it." Elena's chest tightened. "If you want to stop—" "I don't want to stop, but I don't want to keep doing it like this either." He turned to face her. "Like it's something we're both just enduring until it's over." "What else is there?" "I don't know, but there has to be something between treating you like a broodmare and pretending this is a love match." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Catherine left because I didn't know how to give her anything beyond this ranch. I'm not going to make that mistake again." "I'm not Catherine." "I know. You're stronger than she was, more practical. But that doesn't mean you deserve to be treated like you don't matter." Elena sat on the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly unsteady. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this arrangement we made. It's not working. Not the way it is now." Rhett moved closer, stopped just out of reach. "We're married. We're going to have a child together, if we're lucky. We live in the same house, eat at the same table, share a life even if we're both pretending we don't. We can keep trying to maintain these walls, or we can admit they're already crumbling and figure out what to build instead. You want to change the agreement. I want to acknowledge reality." He sat beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat of him. "I come to your room because I have to, not because I want to. And I hate that. I hate reducing you to an obligation. I hate walking away after like what we just did doesn't matter. It's not supposed to matter. But it does." His voice was rough. "At least to me. And I think it does to you too, even if you won't admit it." Elena's hands twisted in her lap. "What do you want from me, Rhett?" "I want you to stop pretending this is easy. I want you to stop acting like you're fine with everything when I can see in your eyes that you're not. I want—" He stopped, exhaled hard. "I want to try to build something real. Not a love story, maybe. but a partnership. Something more than just survival. That's not what we agreed to. Agreements can change. Can they? Elena looked at him directly. You married me because you needed an heir to save your ranch. I married you because I needed security and a place to belong. Those things haven't changed. No, but we have. Rhett's hand found hers, his fingers lacing through hers tentatively. Or at least I have. Somewhere between shoveling snow together and watching you refuse to complain when everything's hard, I started to care about more than just what you can give me. Elena's throat was tight. Don't say things you don't mean. I'm not. His grip tightened. I'm saying I want more. I want to know what you think about when you stare out that window for hours. I want to understand why you chose teaching when it clearly made you miserable. I want to hear you laugh, which I haven't yet, but I think about more than I should. I want... Rhett. Elena pulled her hand away, stood up. You're asking for things I don't know how to give. I came here with realistic expectations. I accepted what this was, and now you're moving the boundaries, asking for connection I didn't prepare for. I know. And if you can't give it, I'll accept that. But I needed to say it out loud. Needed you to know that this isn't just obligation anymore. At least not for me. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold something together that was already breaking apart. What if I do care? What if I've been lying to myself just as much as you have? What happens when the bank still takes everything and we're left with nothing but feelings we weren't supposed to have? Then at least we'll have tried for something more than survival. That's not enough. It's more than I've had in 6 years. The rawness in his voice broke something in Elena. She turned to look at him, this man who'd built walls so high they blocked out light, and saw cracks running through every defense he'd constructed. I read Catherine's letter, she said. Rhett's expression shuddered. You went in that room after you promised. I know. I'm sorry. But I needed to understand what happened, and you weren't going to tell me. Elena moved closer. She wrote about drowning in absence, about being invisible to you. And I understand why you pulled back after that, why you made this arrangement so clinical. You were trying to protect both of us from drowning the same way. I failed. No. You just learned the wrong lesson. Elena reached out, touched his face. Catherine drowned because she needed more than you could give while you were building this empire. But I'm not asking you to choose between me and the ranch. I'm asking you to let me help carry the weight instead of facing it alone. Rhett's hand came up to cover hers. I don't know how to do that. Neither do I, but we can figure it out together. He pulled her into his arms suddenly, holding her tight enough that she could feel his heart beating against her chest. Elena wrapped her arms around him and let herself feel the solid reality of him, muscle and warmth, and the tremor running through his frame that said he was just as scared as she was. I don't want to hurt you, Rhett said against her hair. You will, anyway. That's what people do when they care about each other. They hurt each other and forgive each other and keep trying anyway. That sounds exhausting. It is. He pulled back just enough to look at her face. And you want that? Even knowing how it might end? I want to try. Elena met his eyes. I want more than just surviving this marriage. I want to build something that matters. Rhett kissed her then, and it was nothing like the careful mechanical kisses from before. This was hunger and desperation and the breaking of every wall they'd both been maintaining. Elena kissed him back with equal intensity, pouring 6 weeks of loneliness and want and denied hope into the contact. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Stay, Elena said, not because you have to, because you want to. I want to. His hands framed her face. But if we do this, it can't be like before. I can't keep treating you like an obligation. Then don't. Elena, I'm not asking for love, Rhett. I'm asking for honesty, for respect, for you to see me as a partner instead of a means to an end. She held his gaze. Can you do that? I can try. That's all I'm asking. This time when they came together, it was different, slower, more deliberate. Rhett took his time, paying attention to her responses, learning what made her breath catch and what made her tense. And Elena let herself be present instead of disconnected, let herself feel instead of endure. It still wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments, fumbled touches, times when neither of them knew quite what to do. But it was real in a way the previous times hadn't been. And when it was over, Rhett didn't leave. He stayed, pulling her against his side, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her shoulder. "Tell me something," he said quietly. "Like what?" "Anything. Something I don't know about you." Elena thought about that. "I wanted to be a writer when I was young. Wrote stories about places I'd never been, and people who were braver than I was." "Why didn't you?" "Because writing doesn't pay rent. Teaching barely did, but at least it was steady." She turned her head to look at him. "Your turn." "I wanted to be an architect, design buildings instead of just maintaining them." "Why didn't you?" "My father died. The ranch needed running. Wanting things for yourself is a luxury when people depend on you." They lay there in the darkness, sharing pieces of abandoned dreams. Outside, the wind picked up again. Not storm-strong, just the constant presence of air moving across open land. Inside, two people who'd started as strangers began the slow work of becoming something else. "We're still going to fight," Elena said eventually. "I know, and this might not work. The bank might still take everything." "I know that too, but we're going to try anyway." "Yes." Rhett's arm tightened around her. "We're going to try." Elena closed her eyes and let herself believe it. Not because she was naive, but because the alternative, continuing to live in careful distance, had become unbearable. They'd made a deal based on necessity, but necessity had transformed into something more complicated, something worth fighting for. The next morning, Elena woke to find Rhett still there. He was awake, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked. "Nothing, just, this is new. Good new or bad new?" "I'm not sure yet." He brushed hair back from her face. "But I think I like it." Elena smiled, surprising herself. "Me too." They got up slowly, the morning routine altered by the presence of someone else. Rhett made coffee while Elena started breakfast. They moved around each other in the kitchen, learning a new choreography. When their hands brushed reaching for the same cup, neither of them pulled away. Over breakfast, Rhett spread out his ledgers. "I want to show you something." Elena looked at the columns of numbers: income, expenses, debt service, projections. "You don't have to—" "Yes, I do. You said you wanted to be a partner. Partners know where things stand." He pointed to a line near the bottom. "This is what we need by April. This is what we have now, and this is the gap." The gap was significant. Not impossible, but close. "What can we do?" Elena asked. "Pray for a good calving season, hope the market holds, cut expenses where we can." He looked at her. "And hope that you're carrying my child, because that's the only real leverage we have with the bank." Elena touched her stomach reflexively. Too soon to know, too soon to hope. But the possibility was there now, real and immediate. "We'll figure it out," she said. "We might not. Then we'll figure out what comes after that. Together." Rhett closed the ledger, reached across the table to take her hand. "I'm not used to having someone on my side." "Get used to it." He almost smiled. A real one, not the bitter half-curve she'd seen before. It transformed his face, made him look younger, less burdened. Elena felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. They spent the day working together, Elena helping with the accounts, while Rhett explained the ranch's operations in detail. He showed her which pastures were most productive, which cattle were breeding stock, which horses had the best temperaments. He talked about his plans for expansion if they could survive the loan review, about irrigation systems he wanted to build, about the future he was trying to create. And Elena listened, asked questions, offered suggestions that surprised him. She had a head for numbers from years of managing on tiny budgets, and she saw inefficiencies he'd overlooked. By evening, they'd identified 3 areas where they could cut costs without compromising the herd. "You're good at this," Rhett said. "I had to be. You can't survive on a teacher's salary without being ruthlessly efficient. Still, you see things I miss." That's what partners do. That night, Rhett came to her room again. And the night after that. And the one after that. Each time, it got easier. The awkwardness faded, replaced by familiarity. They learned each other's rhythms, preferences, boundaries, and slowly, carefully, they built something that felt like intimacy. But the deadline still loomed. December passed into January, and Elena's monthly cycle came and went without interruption. She tried not to let Rhett see her disappointment, but he knew anyway. "It's only been 2 months," he said, holding her while she fought back tears she wouldn't let fall. We don't have time for only. We have time enough. But they both knew that wasn't true. April was rushing toward them, and with it the reckoning that would determine whether everything they were building would stand or collapse. February arrived with bitter cold and a letter from the bank. Elena found it when she went to collect the mail from the box at the end of the road, walking the half-mile through snow that crunched under her boots. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive, the kind that held bad news dressed up in formal language. She carried it back to the house tucked inside her coat, delaying the moment when she'd have to hand it over. Rhett was in the barn, working with the young horse that had finally earned a name, Ranger, because he'd proven himself worth keeping. Elena watched through the window as Rhett moved the animal through its paces, patient and methodical, building trust, one repetition at a time. When he came in for lunch, she handed him the letter without preamble. Rhett looked at the return address and his jaw tightened. He opened it carefully, read the contents twice, then set it on the table between them. They want to meet, he said, week after next. Review the loan terms and assess whether to proceed with the current arrangement or call it in. That's earlier than April. They moved up the timeline. He picked up the letter again, scanning for details he might have missed. Says they need to rebalance their portfolio, reduce risk exposure, which means they're looking for excuses to collect. Elena sat across from him, her hands folded on the table to keep them from shaking. What do we tell them? The truth. That we're married, that the ranch is profitable, that we're building something sustainable. He looked at her. Unless you have other ideas. We could lie. Tell them I'm expecting, even if I'm not. And when there's no baby in 9 months? Cross that bridge when we come to it. Rhett shook his head. I won't start this by lying. If we lose the ranch, we lose it honestly. It was exactly what Elena had expected him to say, and exactly what made her chest ache with something too complicated to name. Here was a man who could lose everything and still refuse to compromise his integrity. It was admirable and frustrating in equal measure. Then we tell them the truth, she said. We've only been married 4 months. Conception takes time. They won't care about the timeline. They care about guarantees, and we can't give them any. Elena stood, moved to the window. Outside, the land stretched white and endless, beautiful and unforgiving. She'd come to love this place despite herself. The silence that had seemed oppressive now felt like peace, and the isolation that should have driven her mad had instead given her space to discover who she was when no one else was watching. I'm not ready to give this up, she said quietly. Neither am I. She turned to look at him. Not just the ranch. This. Us. Whatever we've been building. Rhett crossed to her, pulled her into his arms. She went willingly, pressing her face against his chest and breathing in the smell of leather and horses and the soap he used. He'd become familiar in ways she'd never expected. The rhythm of his breathing when he slept, the way he rubbed his jaw when he was thinking, the particular silence that meant he was angry versus the silence that meant he was tired. We'll figure something out, he said against her hair. You don't know that. No, but I'm choosing to believe it anyway. Elena pulled back to look at him. Since when do you believe in anything? Since you. His hand cupped her face. You made me want things again, Elena. Made me think maybe I could have more than just survival. That's worth fighting for. She kissed him then, pouring frustration and fear and desperate hope into the contact. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. We have 2 weeks, Elena said. Let's make them count. They spent those weeks working like people possessed. Rhett went over the books again and again, tightening projections, documenting every asset. Elena helped, her teacher's precision turning the ledgers into presentations the bank couldn't ignore. They documented the herd's health, the property's improvements, the careful management that had kept the ranch profitable even in hard years. But numbers only told part of the story. The rest was written in the hope neither of them wanted to acknowledge, that maybe, just maybe, Elena's body would provide the answer the bank wanted to hear. She woke one morning in early March feeling different. Nothing she could name, just a subtle shift in how her body felt. She ignored it, told herself she was imagining things because she wanted them to be true. But the feeling persisted, and when her monthly cycle should have arrived and didn't, she let herself wonder. She waited 3 days before saying anything to Rhett. 3 days of watching for signs, of second-guessing every sensation, of being terrified to hope and unable to stop herself from hoping anyway. On the 4th morning, she found him in the barn and just said it straight out. I think I might be pregnant. Rhett froze, the brush he'd been using on Ranger's coat hanging loose in his hand. You think? I'm late. Not by much, but enough to notice. And I feel different. I can't explain it better than that. He set down the brush carefully, like it was made of glass. How different? Like my body knows something my brain hasn't caught up to yet. Elena wrapped her arms around herself. I could be wrong. It's too early to be certain. But you don't think you're wrong? No. Rhett crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. She felt him shaking, or maybe that was her, or maybe both of them together, holding each other up against the weight of possibility. We can't tell the bank yet, Elena said against his chest. Not until we're sure. I know. And even if I am pregnant, that doesn't solve everything. The ranch still needs to be profitable. The numbers still have to work. I know that too. He pulled back to look at her. But it's hope, Elena. Real hope. Not just wishful thinking. That's more than we had yesterday. They told Mrs. Jensen first, mainly because the cook noticed Elena's sudden aversion to the smell of coffee, and put 2 and 2 together without being asked. The older woman's face softened in a way Elena had never seen, and she squeezed Elena's hand with flour-dusted fingers. About time this house had life in it again, Mrs. Jensen said. You take care of yourself, girl, and tell that fool husband of yours to stop working you so hard. I'm fine. You won't be if you keep hauling firewood and mucking stalls. Let the men do the heavy work. You focus on growing that baby. It was the closest thing to affection Mrs. Jensen had ever shown, and it made Elena's throat tight. She nodded, accepting the concern, even though she had no intention of becoming an invalid just because she might be carrying a child. The meeting with the bank was scheduled for March 15th. Rhett and Elena rode into town the day before, leaving the ranch in the hands of the foreman and staying overnight at the hotel. It was the first time they'd been away from the property together, the first time they'd existed in a space that wasn't defined by work and isolation. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed in a room that smelled like other people's travel, Elena felt the full weight of what they were facing. Tomorrow they'd sit across from men who held their future in portfolios and spreadsheets, who saw the ranch as nothing more than numbers on a page. What if they say no? She asked into the darkness. Then we figure out what comes next. What does come next? If we lose the ranch, where do we go? Rhett was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, but wherever it is, we go together. You'd give up the ranch for me? I'd give up anything for you. He turned to face her. 6 months ago, this place was everything. Now you are. The ranch is just land and cattle. You're everything else. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. Don't say things like that before a meeting where I need to appear competent and composed. Why not? Because I'll cry, and they'll think I'm weak. Anyone who thinks you're weak is an idiot. He pulled her closer. You're the strongest person I know, Elena. You took a gamble on a man who offered you nothing but a contract, and you turned it into something real. That takes more courage than anything I've ever done. She kissed him, tasting salt and need and the desperation of people facing an uncertain future. They made love slowly, carefully, aware that this might be one of the last nights they had in the life they'd built. Tomorrow could change everything, and neither of them knew which direction the change would run. Morning came too soon. Elena dressed in her best outfit, a navy dress she'd remade from one of Catherine's abandoned gowns, altered to fit her frame and stripped of its excessive decoration. She looked respectable, settled, like a woman who belonged exactly where she was. Rhett wore his only suit, the one he'd been married in, the fabric still holding creases from months of disuse. They walked to the bank together, not speaking, their hands clasped tight enough to hurt. The building was new brick, imposing in its permanence. Inside, a clerk directed them to a conference room where 3 men in expensive suits waited behind a table stacked with papers. The lead banker was a Mr. Hutchinson, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, the kind of man who'd built a career on knowing when people were lying. He gestured to 2 chairs across from the banker's side of the table. Mr. Calder, Mrs. Calder, thank you for coming. We appreciate you making time to meet with us, Rhett said, his voice carefully neutral. Hutchinson opened a folder, scanned its contents. I'll be direct. Your loan is underwater based on current market projections. The land value hasn't appreciated as anticipated, and your herd size, while respectable, doesn't provide sufficient collateral for the amount outstanding. The herd has grown 30% since the loan was issued, Rhett said, and the land value assessment you're using is from a drought year. Current conditions justify a higher valuation. Perhaps, but this bank has obligations to its investors. We can't carry risky loans indefinitely. Hutchinson looked at Elena. I understand you married recently, Mrs. Calder. In September, Elena confirmed. And you're settling into ranch life? I am. It's quite different from teaching, I imagine. Elena felt the trap in the question, the implication that she was unsuited, that she'd run like Catherine had. It's different, she agreed, but I prefer it. Teaching other people's children was never as satisfying as building something of my own. Building what exactly? A home, a family, a legacy. She met his gaze squarely. My husband and I are partners in every sense of the word. I understand the ranch's finances as well as he does. I know what we're working toward and what's at stake. This isn't a marriage of convenience. It's a genuine partnership built on shared goals and mutual respect. One of the other bankers leaned forward. Are you expecting a child, Mrs. Calder? Elena hesitated. Too early to confirm, too important to deny. We're hopeful, she said carefully. We've only been married 6 months. These things take time. Indeed they do. Hutchinson made a note. Mr. Calder, your projections for the coming year assume favorable market conditions. What happens if those conditions don't materialize? They went back and forth for an hour, the bankers probing for weaknesses while Rhett defended their position with facts and figures. Elena added details when needed, showing she understood crop rotation and breeding cycles, that she wasn't just decorative but integral to the operation. Finally, Hutchinson sat back. I'll be frank with you both. This loan is marginal at best. Under normal circumstances, we'd call it in and cut our losses. Elena's chest tightened, but she kept her face neutral. However, Hutchinson continued, you've demonstrated commitment to making this work. The ranch is well managed, the improvements documented, and your partnership appears genuine. He looked at Elena. You remind me of my own wife, Mrs. Calder. She came west with nothing and built a life through sheer determination. I respect that. What are you saying? Rhett asked. I'm saying we'll extend the loan on modified terms. Higher interest rate, 3% instead of 2%, but we'll give you another 2 years to demonstrate sustained profitability. Hutchinson slid a paper across the table. Contingent on quarterly reviews. If you fall behind on payments, or if the ranch shows signs of decline, we reserve the right to call the loan immediately. It wasn't what they'd hoped for, but it was more than they'd feared. Elena looked at Rhett, saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. 3% was manageable if the calving season went well. Quarterly reviews meant constant scrutiny, but they'd survive scrutiny if they stayed on top of the books. We'll take it, Rhett said. They signed papers, shook hands, and walked out of the bank into afternoon sunshine that felt brighter than it had any right to be. Once they were clear of the building, Rhett pulled Elena into an alley between the bank and the mercantile and kissed her hard enough to make her dizzy. We did it, he said against her mouth. We bought time. That's not the same as winning. It's close enough. He rested his forehead against hers. 2 years, Elena. 2 years to make this work. We can do that. Yes, she agreed. We can. They spent the rest of the day in town, ordering supplies and visiting the doctor to confirm what Elena's body had been telling her. The doctor, an older woman with kind eyes and no-nonsense manner, examined Elena and delivered the news with a smile. About 6 weeks along, I'd say. Everything looks healthy. You're young and strong. You should have an easy time of it. Elena felt relief and terror in equal measure. A child. Real and growing, no longer just possibility, but certainty. Rhett's hand found hers, squeezed tight. When? He asked. Late October, early November. The doctor made notes in her record book. You'll want to take it easy as you get further along. No heavy lifting, plenty of rest. And come see me if anything feels wrong. They left the doctor's office walking on air, the weight of the bank meeting lifting now that they had this concrete hope to hold on to. A child arriving in October meant they'd have proof of their commitment long before the first quarterly review. Meant the bank would see a family, not just a business arrangement. That night, back at the hotel, Rhett was almost giddy, a word Elena would never have associated with him before. He kept touching her stomach. His hand splayed across fabric and flesh, like he could feel the life growing beneath, even though it was far too small yet. "I'm going to be a father," he said, wonder in his voice. "You're going to be insufferable," Elena teased. "Probably." He kissed her, soft and reverent. "Thank you." "For what?" "For this. For staying. For turning a transaction into—" He gestured helplessly, unable to find words for what they'd become. "A family," Elena finished. "Yes, that." They went home the next day, the wagon loaded with supplies and hope. The ranch looked different now, not just land and buildings, but the place where their child would grow up. Elena found herself seeing it through different eyes, noticing the places that would need to be made safe, the rooms that could become a nursery, the future stretching out in ways she'd never let herself imagine before. Spring came in fits and starts, snow giving way to mud, giving way to the first green shoots of grass. The calving season started, and Rhett spent 18-hour days in the fields, helping cows through difficult births and making sure every calf survived. Elena helped where she could, though Rhett tried to keep her away from the heavy work. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she told him when he tried to stop her from carrying water to the barn. "I know, but I'm not taking chances. You can't wrap me in cotton, Rhett. I'll go crazy." "Then go crazy inside where it's warm and there's nothing that can kick you." They compromised. Elena managed the house and the accounts while Rhett handled the physical labor. Mrs. Jensen came more often, bullying Elena into resting and bringing food that Elena's changing body could tolerate. The nausea was worst in the mornings, but by afternoon she could usually keep down bread and mild cheese. By mid-April, the calving was done and the count was better than expected. They'd lost only 2 calves, well below average, and the surviving stock was strong and healthy. Rhett updated the ledgers with numbers that actually justified the bank's continued investment. The first quarterly review was a formality. Hutchinson looked over the books, noted the documented pregnancy, and signed off on their continued solvency without drama. As they left, he pulled Rhett aside. "You've got a good woman there," he said. "Don't take that for granted." "I won't," Rhett promised. Summer arrived with heat that made Elena grateful for the thick walls of the house. Her body changed in ways both fascinating and uncomfortable, her belly swelling, her back aching, her emotions swinging between joy and terror sometimes within the same hour. Rhett adapted, learning to read her moods, knowing when she needed space and when she needed to be held. They talked about names lying in bed at night, Rhett's hand on her stomach feeling for the kicks that grew stronger as the weeks passed. "If it's a boy, I was thinking James," Rhett said, "after my father. And if it's a girl, I don't know. What do you think?" Elena considered. "Anne. It was my mother's name." "Anne Calder." Rhett tested it. "I like it." "James or Anne, then. Sounds like we have a plan. First plan we've made that didn't involve banks or survival." Elena laughed. "True, but I think I like this kind of planning better." The second quarterly review came and went smoothly. The ranch was profitable, the herd thriving, and Elena's pregnancy visible proof that they were building something permanent. Hutchinson barely glanced at the books before approving them for another quarter. July brought a heat wave that drove everyone into shade wherever they could find it. August was worse, the sun beating down relentlessly, turning grass brown and tempers short. Elena was huge now, uncomfortable in every position, counting down the days until October. "I can't do this for 2 more months," she told Rhett, one particularly miserable evening. "Yes, you can. You're the strongest person I know, remember?" "I'm a whale, a sweaty, grumpy whale who can't see her own feet." Rhett kissed her forehead. "You're beautiful." "You're a liar, but I appreciate the effort." September cooled things down, and Elena felt like she could breathe again. The baby was active now, movements visible from the outside, little feet or fists pushing against her skin. Rhett was fascinated, spending hours with his hand on her belly, talking to the child who couldn't possibly understand but seemed to respond to his voice anyway. "What are you telling them?" Elena asked one night. "Everything, about the ranch, the horses, the way snow looks on the mountains, about their mother, who's the bravest person I've ever met. You're going to spoil them before they're even born." "That's my right as a father." Elena's water broke on October 28th, a week earlier than the doctor had predicted. The contractions started mild and grew steadily worse. Rhett rode to fetch the doctor while Mrs. Jensen stayed with Elena, timing the pains and boiling water and doing all the practical things that needed doing. The labor was long, almost 20 hours, and brutal in ways Elena hadn't prepared for despite the doctor's warnings. There were moments when she thought she couldn't endure another minute, moments when the pain was so total it erased everything else. But Rhett stayed with her, holding her hand, letting her crush his fingers, whispering encouragement even when she cursed him for getting her into this situation. And then, finally, a cry. "It's a girl," the doctor announced, holding up a tiny, red-faced creature who was screaming her displeasure at the world. Elena collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted beyond words. The doctor cleaned the baby and wrapped her in a blanket before placing her in Elena's arms. She was so small, impossibly fragile, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably be brown like Rhett's. "Anne," Elena whispered. Rhett was crying, actual tears tracking down his weathered face as he looked at his daughter. "She's perfect." "She's loud," Elena said, but she was smiling. Anne nursed for the first time, latching on with determination that made the doctor laugh. "This one knows what she wants. She'll keep you on your toes." Over the next weeks, Elena learned the exhaustion that came with new motherhood. The endless cycle of feeding and changing and trying to sleep in snatches between Anne's demands. But she also learned joy in forms she'd never experienced. The weight of Anne sleeping on her chest, the smell of her skin, the tiny fingers that gripped Elena's thumb with surprising strength. Rhett was transformed. The hard man who'd advertised for a wife had become someone who sang lullabies off-key and spent hours just watching Anne sleep. He'd built a cradle with his own hands, carved with horses and mountains, a piece of art that would last generations. The third quarterly review happened in early November, with Anne only 2 weeks old. Hutchinson came to the ranch this time instead of making them travel to town. He looked at the books, noted the continued profitability, and then asked to see the baby. Elena brought Anne out, wrapped in the blanket Mrs. Jensen had made. Hutchinson's stern face softened as he looked at the tiny girl. "My congratulations," he said. "She's beautiful." "Thank you," Rhett said. "I'll be honest with you both. When you first came to me with this loan, I had serious doubts, but you've proven me wrong at every turn." Hutchinson closed the ledger. "I'm recommending to the board that we convert this to a standard mortgage at market rates. You've more than demonstrated your ability to manage the property and your commitment to building something sustainable." It was more than they'd hoped for. Elena felt tears prick her eyes, and Rhett's hand found hers. "We appreciate that," Rhett said, his voice rough with emotion. After Hutchinson left, Rhett pulled Elena into his arms, careful of the baby between them. "We did it. Actually did it. We're not out of debt yet." "No, but we're on solid ground. The ranch is ours as long as we keep making payments, and the payments are manageable now." Elena looked around the house, their home, earned through work and hope, and refusing to give up when everything seemed impossible. "I can't believe we're here." "Where?" "Safe. Settled. A family." She looked at Anne sleeping peacefully through the conversation. "I came here expecting nothing but survival, and somehow we ended up with everything." "Not everything," Rhett said. "Not yet." "What are we missing?" "This." He kissed her, soft and sweet. "I love you, Elena. I should have said it months ago, but I was too scared, too convinced that admitting I cared would somehow ruin it. But I love you, more than the ranch, more than any plan I had for my life. You and Anne, you're everything." Elena's throat was tight. "I love you too. Have for a while now, but I thought keeping it to myself was safer. We're both idiots." "Agreed." She kissed him back. "But we're idiots who figured it out eventually." Winter came again, but this time the isolation felt different. The house was full of life. Anne's cries, Rhett's laughter, the sound of Elena singing while she worked. They'd transformed the spare room into a nursery, and Catherine's old room stayed closed but no longer felt haunted. The past was the past, and they were building something new. Elena returned to the accounts in the new year, working while Anne napped, finding satisfaction in seeing the numbers improve month by month. She had ideas for the ranch, expansion possibilities, efficiency improvements, ways to maximize their land use. And Rhett listened to all of them, implementing the ones that made sense. "You should handle the business side, Bigdan," he told her one evening. "You're better at it than I am." "You want me to run the ranch?" "I want us to run it together. I'll manage the cattle and horses, you manage the money and planning, real partners, like we said. So that's what they became. Rhett in the fields, Elena at the desk, both of them working toward the same goals. When spring arrived and calving season started again, Elena was back to full strength, helping where she could while Mrs. Jensen watched Anne. The ranch prospered. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. Each year brought small improvements. A new barn, better breeding stock, irrigation that allowed them to expand their grazing land. The debt shrank slowly but surely, and by the time Anne was 3, they'd paid off half the mortgage. They had 2 more children in the following years, a boy they named James as planned, and another girl they called Margaret after Rhett's mother. The house filled with noise and chaos, and the careful distance that had defined their early marriage became a distant memory. They fought sometimes, usually about money or how to handle the children's discipline. But they also laughed. Rhett had been right. Elena's laugh was worth waiting for, bright and unreserved and completely transforming her face. On their 5th anniversary, Rhett found Elena in the kitchen after the children were in bed. He pulled a paper from his pocket and handed it to her. "What's this?" she asked. "Read it." Elena unfolded the paper. It was the original contract, the stark advertisement he'd placed, the clinical description of what he'd wanted, the marriage reduced to terms and conditions. She hadn't seen it in years. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. Rhett took the paper from her hands, walked to the fireplace, and tossed it in. They watched it burn, the words disappearing into ash. "Because we don't need it anymore," he said. "We haven't needed it for a long time. We started with a transaction, but we built something real, and I wanted to mark the moment when we stopped being a deal and became a choice." Elena moved into his arms, resting her head against his chest. "I'd choose you every time." Even knowing how it started? Especially knowing that. We could have stayed strangers who shared a house. Instead, we became something neither of us expected. A family. Yes, that. Outside, the land stretched endlessly under a sky full of stars. Inside, children slept soundly, animals were safe in their barns, and 2 people who'd come together out of desperation had built a life worth fighting for. The ranch would outlast them both, passed down to Anne and James and Margaret, who would pass it to their own children in time. But the legacy wasn't just land and cattle. It was the knowledge that sometimes the best things came from the hardest beginnings. That love wasn't always the starting point. Sometimes it was the destination you reached by refusing to give up, by choosing each day to try, to build, to become something more than survival. Elena had come to Montana expecting nothing but a roof and security. She'd found a partner, a family, and a home carved from wilderness and will. Rhett had advertised for a transaction and discovered that what he'd really needed all along was someone who'd stand beside him, challenge him, and refuse to let him settle for less than he deserved. They'd both gambled on a deal that seemed impossible, and they'd both won something neither of them knew they were playing for. A love built on honesty, respect, and the stubborn belief that even the coldest beginnings could warm into something worth keeping. The contract burned to nothing in the fireplace. Outside, snow began to fall, gentle and steady, covering the land in fresh white. And inside, Rhett and Elena stood together, watching the past disappear into smoke, looking toward a future they'd built with their own hands. It wasn't the story either of them had planned, but it was theirs, earned through hardship and sealed with courage, and it would outlast them both.